Greetings, everybody. My name is Dave Hrachovina. Rock of Ages, Hrachovina, and you've got it. So that's how my last name is pronounced. And I'm so glad to be here with you, not only to make this presentation, but to have you as my fellow Kenney people. And you've all been so kind and welcoming to me. I can't help but just be grateful for that. And I hope you'll enjoy the little presentation we're going to do today. We're going to talk about the birthplace of Seattle, which is Alki Beach, originally pronounced Alki, with a short I. And it was a Chinook jargon word. And we'll come to learn what it means in just a little while. But first, let's go way back. How did Puget Sound come into being? Do you know?
Volcano?
Not a volcano.
Glaciers.
Glaciers. Do you know what the name of the glacier was?
Ooh, let's see.
No, the Vashon Glacier.
Vashon.
Yeah, the Vashon Glacier.
They left Vashon Island too.
Yeah, left Vashon Island behind too. As it receded, it cut out what we call Puget Sound. And so the Vashon Glacier was pretty thick. How many space needles do you think you would have had to stack on top of it, one on top of the other, to find out how thick it would be? One? Two? Two? How about three? It would have taken 3 space needles. So that was quite a thing, but it left us a beautiful area, didn't it? And we can always be grateful for what we have, can't we? And thankful for all those things. Then we want to talk about how did the First Nations sort of spread out in this area. Well, most of them started down around the Columbia River, and there were large groupings, and the Chinook was one of those large groupings, but as they went farther and farther away from each other, their language changed. And so they found that they needed to have a common language so they could trade. If you wanted to trade a blanket for a fish, you had to know what the other person was talking about. So they developed something called Chinook jargon. And not only did the First Nations use that for their trade language, when the pioneers and the explorers came in, they picked up on it. And sometimes they even added words to it, or sometimes the word had to be changed because the native peoples couldn't get their tongue around it. So, for example, the word for fish became pish. Pish, P-I-S-H, because they couldn't pronounce the English F. And so, if you were going to eat fish, that would be pish muckamuck. Pish muckamuck. My favorite one, though, is eating a hooved animal. It wouldn't have to necessarily be some kind of cattle, but it wouldn't have to be domesticated cattle. And it was moose muckamuck. That would have to be eating your beef roast dinner. Moose muckamuck. So, anyway, moving forward a little bit to the time of Chief Seattle, he was both Duwamish and Suquamish. The Duwamish were obviously over here on the Duwamish Peninsula. The Suquamish were over on the Kitsap Peninsula. But his mother was Duwamish and his father was Suquamish, so he was both. And he was born into a prominent family, so he was in a sense royalty to begin with. But he was born in 1786. Now here's your pop quiz. What happened in 1776? Declaration of Independence. So the country was 10 years old when Chief Seattle was born. Another interesting thing is that George Vancouver was exploring, and he came on a ship called the Discovery, and he missed, if I remember correctly, he was looking for the mouth of the Columbia River and he missed it. So he came in the Straits of Juan de Fuca and down into Puget Sound. And the native peoples knew that somebody was coming, but they had never seen an English man-of-war ship. I mean, that was just close encounters of the third kind. I mean, it was all new to them, and it was amazing. And he came in 1792, so Chief Seattle would have been about 6 years old. And he may have remembered that. Vancouver moored off the southern tip of Bainbridge Island. That's where he moored for a while. And they sent out Peter Puget, Puget Sound, to explore the southern extremities of Puget Sound. And then that's the explorers, and then of course the pioneers started coming in and taking stock of the area. There were a couple of men, the Maple brothers, already up the Duwamish River quite a ways before 1851 when the Alki landing party came. So there were pioneers who came in and trappers and so forth, and they all used the trade language too. So it was easy for them to pick it up. And then after that, we'll come all the way up to 1851, and that's when the Denny Boren party left Cherry Grove, Illinois. They came across the Oregon Trail. And there's really a wonderful book that I didn't know existed until our former museum director, is that right? Director told me about it. Sarah Balinson told me about it. It's Four Wagons West, and it's by Roberta Fry Watt, and that would have been the granddaughter of Arthur Denny. She wrote this, but she talks about the trip coming across the Oregon Trail, and she gives some interesting little anecdotes of things that happened to them on the way. For example, they'd been traveling all day, and they couldn't get very far in a day. It took them 4 months to do the 2,000-mile trek, and they'd been walking all day, and the girls wanted to quit walking and start playing. And so they were told not to go near these mounds of dirt. Well, guess where they went? That's where they went. And they learned their lesson, though, because some black ants came pouring out and they bit the girls. So that's why they didn't want them to go over there. So evidently, I would say they probably didn't do that again. So. And then they came to a place called Independence Rock. It was a huge rock in the ground, and it was the great registry of the desert. And people would write their names on it as they went by. And evidently, some of the Denny party, the women, wrote their names on that rock. And Louisa Boren claimed that she had a faded photograph of that event. So I've never seen the photograph, but so anyway, then they were coming across Idaho, and that's where I lived for quite a while. And they were down in southern Idaho on the eastern side, and there's a place called American Falls. And there they were chased by some of the native peoples because they wanted to trade a string of ponies for Louisa Boren. Of course, they weren't going to have anything to do with that. So they took off, and there were bullets flying and dust, and they kept going and finally got away. And they met up then with the John Lowe party, and the campfire and the welcoming light was mighty comforting to them at that point. So they joined up, and they kept coming. And then in eastern Oregon, Arthur Denny writes in Pioneer Days that they met a fella named Brock, B-R-O-C-K. They couldn't remember his first name. but he sang the praises of Puget Sound. So they originally had intended to come across and homestead under the 1850 Free Land Act in the Willamette Valley. When they got to Portland, most of them were tired, some of them were sick, and so they needed to rest up for a while. But Arthur Denny sent his younger brother David Denny and John Lowe up to scout Puget Sound. And they walked, it was a 200-mile trail from Portland to Olympia. But there was a settlement in Olympia, and there were other settlements along the way already, like in Chehalis and so forth. And so they got up there, and lo and behold, a fella named Lee Terry wants to join up with them. Meanwhile, back in Portland, his brother Charles, unbeknownst to either one of them, kind of glummed on to the Denny's. And so the Terry brothers became a part of that group. And so they went the 60 miles on ship up the Puget Sound north. And when they saw Alki Point, they said, this is the place. This is where we want to settle. This is where we want to homestead. This is where we want to start a township. And so David Denny sent word back to his brother Arthur in Portland saying, come at once. There's room for 1,000 settlers. Well, that was big thoughts to him. And so John Lowe commissioned David and Lee to build a cabin, and he took off to get the rest of them in Portland and bring them up. After a while, they realized that, well, they had the sides of the cabin built. It wasn't rain ready. It didn't have a roof. And they didn't have the correct tool to make the roof, to make the shingles, which was called a froe. It's a long, thin axe on a wooden handle. They take a wooden mallet and pound it down through to make the shingles out of cedar. So Lee Terry takes off, and eventually we think he headed for Olympia. There was a general store down there. And that left 19-year-old David Denny alone. And it was November. And it was raining. And he didn't have a roof. And so he made a lean-to out of some boughs of the trees. And every once in a while, he'd go back to get some foodstuffs out of the cabin. And one time when he went back, he realized that the skunks had stolen his food. So the skunks had stolen his food.
Oh my.
Yeah, so he was, and to add insult to injury, he injured himself. He cut his foot with an axe, he got blood poisoning, and he got a disease that they called the ague. It rhymes with flu, as far as I can tell. But it was like malarial fevers and chills. And so he was in pretty sad shape. So he'd been alone for a week, he cut his foot. 2 more weeks go by. It's November 13th. It's one of those days when the rain is oppressive. It's clammy. Somebody said it rains a chaos in Seattle. That's true. But the ship called the Exact, it was a schooner, came up around the Olympic Peninsula through the Straits of Juan de Fuca and back down into Puget Sound, and they were offloading everybody. And David Denny got up enough energy to come down and to say, remember what he said to begin with? There's room for 1,000 settlers. Now he said, oh, I wish you hadn't come. And that was the inauspicious beginning of Seattle. He didn't mean ever, obviously, but right now. You know, it was the women wore the big bonnets, starched, and they're all flopped down around their face. The children were
Whoa.
squalling, and the women, the teardrops were coming down, and the rain was raining. And so somebody once said that Seattle was born in the teardrops of the women and the raindrops from heaven. So. Then, probably at that time, Chief Seattle was on the beach when they arrived, and perhaps I like to think that he greeted them in Chinook jargon, using the word for hello and goodbye. I don't know whether he did, but I just like to think that maybe he did. And he always had a blanket. He would hold his blanket with his hand, and then he raised his hand in friendly greeting. And there's a statue of him like that downtown. And I always think that he said, Klahowya. Klahowya. We can learn, that's the word for hello and goodbye in Chinook jargon, like aloha is hello and goodbye, and in Hawaiian. So, Klahowya, Klahowya. Let's try that. Let's see if we can remember that. So it's spelled K, L, A, and then I'm going to capitalize these because this is where the emphasis is. So, Klahowya, Klahowya. We can remember it with the knock-knock joke if you'll go along with me on this. Knock-knock.
Who's there?
Klahowya.
Klahowya who?
How you doing? And you just leave the doing off and you're there. You have it. What was the other Chinook jargon word that we learned?
Fish.
Fish, okay.
Fish, woo-woo.
We also learned another one.
Moose, moose, moose.
Moose, moose, muck, muck. Yeah. The name for the beach?
Alki.
Alki.
No.
With a short I. We pronounce it Alki nowadays, but that is the correct Chinook jargon pronunciation. Does anybody know what it means?
No.
By and by.
By and by, soon. So they wanted to name Seattle New York Alki. New York, by and by. Now how did that get attached to New York? The Terry brothers were from New York. Well, several stories are told, but my favorite one is about a ship captain that was coming down around the point. He saw a couple men on the beach by a fire, and he yelled out, "What's the name of this town?" And they yelled back, "New York." And he yelled back, "Yes, New York Alki, I reckon. New York by and by, I reckon." So that's how it got attached. That's my favorite story anyway. So. But pretty soon, within about 4 months of their arrival in February of 1852, they realized how shallow Alki was and how rough it was. And it just wasn't that great of a seaport area. They also began to realize they could make some money by selling logs to the ships coming up from San Francisco during the gold rush. So they got in a canoe and they paddled over to the eastern side of Elliott Bay, and they had a clump of horseshoes on Mrs. Arthur Denny's clothesline, which they were under strict instructions to return. They were not to lose the clothesline. And that's how they found out how deep it was. And according to what I read, the first 2 unofficial stakes, and somebody can correct me if I'm wrong on this, I could very well be, were what we call Spring and Cherry Streets. That was the first unofficial platting of Seattle. So it was done before the 1854 treaty where Chief Seattle signed away the lands that he oversaw. So what I like to say, therefore, is that the big city hustle bustle, high rise, concrete jungle went over on the other side of Elliott Bay. And over here, we kept the laid back Alki by and by. And it's really true, although now the people can get back over here on, on the high-rise bridge. But if you think about it, think of the wonderful treasures we have in West Seattle and on Duwamish, and especially Alki. The concrete promenade, the sandy beach, and then there's kind of a rockery bulkhead all the way around. Duwamish head over to Seacrest Park. That whole strip is Seattle City Park. And the paper said it's for the whole community. That was in the, I guess it was the Herald at that time. Maybe it was another paper. But I remember that quote. So that's why all the businesses and all the condominiums and houses are set back. Nobody has more access to it than anybody else. And so when you go to Alki, it's always refreshing. When you go to Alki, you have to do three things. You have to look down and listen to the soothing water splashing. You have to look out and see the ferry boats skimming by and the wonderful whitecaps that are often on the water. And then look up at the majestic Olympic Mountains, and it always lifts your spirits. So I have a favorite story about Alki, and that favorite story is about a rainbow. And some years ago I was up here taking care of my parents, and my mother had had open heart surgery for the second time. She was at Swedish Hospital, and my father was getting ready to have his aorta replaced. So it was, I was kind of worn out, you can imagine. And so I told my dad one afternoon after we went to visit my mother, you wanted to take a nap, why don't you go ahead and I'm going to run down to Alki for a little bit. So I ran down and I got a cheeseburger somewhere, I don't know where it was. And then as I was driving back home, I went around the long way, cruising the loop, and all of a sudden, out of the dark clouds, a beautiful rainbow came down.
Look at that way, right? Towards the mountains.
Actually, it was going towards where my mother was in the hospital. And not quite, but that direction. And as far as I can tell, that was about the time the Lord called her home. So God kept his promise to her. And I can say this here for the sake of Christ, to take her to heaven.
Oh, dear.
And so I was comforted. And so Alki, again, was a blessing to me. And the rainbow that God promised Noah he would never destroy the world again with a flood, and he hasn't. He kept his promises to my mother as well, vouched safe to her in her holy baptism. So I was a Lutheran pastor, that's why I'm talking that way right now. But anyway, I hope that you will always be grateful for what we do have, and thankful for Alki, and thankful for the opportunity to sometimes have the chance to take a look and see the magnificence of what God has done, and know that that's for everybody, and that can't be taken away from you. Chief Seattle once said you can't sell the air. What he was trying to get at is that there are certain things that just aren't for sale, that belong to everybody. And I think, I'm so glad that Alki is one of those for us. Yes?
I just thought I'd tell you that I lived over there, and I raised my kids in Suquamish.
Yeah.
And Suquamish.
Yeah, your kids in Suquamish?
Yes.
Yeah.
So, I lived over there
Good.
in that area.
Yeah, okay.
Raised my family.
Yeah. The other interesting thing about Chief Seattle that I didn't know is that he was baptized into the Christian faith and was given a Christian name.
Wow.
Does anybody know what it is? It has to do with the Old Testament, lots of water, and wooden boat. Noah. Noah. And that's on his tombstone over at, is it Port Madison? It says Noah South. And then it says chief of the Duwamish and Suquamish tribes and so forth. Yes. So, anyway, what I'd like to do now is just ask if you would like to share how you got here. What was your arrival? For me, I was born at the old Maynard Hospital. So I was born here. I was watching the movie Sergeant York, and there's a scene that I like where they're in the general store of Pastor Pyle, and there's a salesman there. And he asks Zeke, who's whittling away on his wood, how'd you get here? And he says, I were born here.
I were born here.
So, but maybe some of you arrived in a different way, like the Denny party did. We all got here somehow. How'd you get here?
I was born
You were born here?
here. Yeah, Alki Beach.
Alki Beach. Yeah, you were telling us that earlier, weren't you?
Yeah.
Yeah. And,
I lived in this area all my life,
yeah. Great.
outside of World War II.
Well, that stirred up a lot of stuff, didn't it? Yeah, but you came back.
Yeah.
I lived in Boise, Idaho for 30 years and was really glad to get back to the marine climate. They say, you know, that it's the heat is dry over there. Well, that just mummifies you that much more quickly. Anybody else? Okay.
We have a beautiful church. My father's a pastor there, was a pastor there, and it was Lutheran, and it was there in the early years in Chinook, Montana.
Oh, okay. Chinook, Montana.
And,
Wow.
And the people love the area, and there's all kinds of forests around there.
Right. How did you get here?
We're going to university.
Oh, University of Washington?
Yeah.
And that's where you met? No.
Well,
Portland, okay. All right, well, you've been to a lot of places that the Denny's.
the Denny's are well known,
Yeah.
and of course, they did a lot to establish.
They did a lot to establish the city. Thank you.
I'm from North Carolina, and I think I got here the same way a lot of other people did. My dad came out here to work for Bowie
Okay.
in 1944.
Yeah, my grandparents came out during the First World War from St. Paul, Minnesota to work in the shipyards. So that's how we got out here. Let me find my way here.
I grew up in Wisconsin. I was teaching in Alaska. I flew back on Alaska Airlines to Seattle, and there's an airline strike. So I stayed for 3 weeks, took the train back to Wisconsin, and decided I'm going to go back there and live.
Yeah, once you've landed here, there's no escaping Seattle. Yeah, like I said, I came back. Yeah, so very good. Paulsville, yeah.
That was over there where I raised my family.
Okay, very good. Yeah. Is some of your family over here now? Is that why you're here, or?
Well, you know, everybody's kind of grown old now.
Oh,
And,
Happens to that.
huh? Well, let's see, what am I gonna say? But they're all over here.
yeah.
And, we were all lived there, Suquamish, and had a very wonderful life. We were right next to the Indian reservation.
Oh, nice.
Right there, the Suquamish tribe.
Yeah, very nice. Yeah.
Yeah.
Anybody else have a rival story, how they got here? Or how did your folks get here?
They didn't, they were dead.
Train.
And they passed away.
Train, okay. Okay. Anybody else? Well, thank you for sharing those. Those are all very interesting stories, and I think you probably, in your mind and your heart, can think of a story or two that has a lot of meaning for you about Alki or being here in Seattle.
My daughter got engaged.
What's that?
My daughter was engaged, got engaged, Alki.
Oh, nice. Yeah,
To a young
that's.
man from Omaha, Nebraska.
And they stayed here?
No,
Oh. Well, I tried.
they're there.
Okay. And so that's Alki Beach, and we have wonderful thoughts and can think about Alki, and it's always uplifting. It's recreational. And so the Duwamish Peninsula has always been a little bit isolated, but they had to figure out how to get back over here when they went over to the eastern side. And so there's a great display about the bridges up in the hallway just behind the desk. And then you go down around there, and that's been put up by the Southwest Seattle Historical Society. And I urge you to take a look. There's even a piece of twisted metal from the drawbridge that was run into by the ship called the Chavez, Captain Rolf Neslin.
Oh, yeah.
And 1978, he's coming down the canal, and it was late at night, and he'd been drinking, and he was in his 80s, and he just gave the wrong directions, and there he ran the ship into the western side of the northern bridge, and it got stuck in an upward position, and that was the impetus then to finally push Seattle in the direction of doing a high-rise bridge. You know, they said the high-rise bridge is so high, no ship will ever hit it. Never say never.
Yeah.
There was one ship that just unloaded, and then coming back, just scraped the very bottom of that bridge. So, and then of course there's the high-rise bridge now, but there were trestles that came over to bring the trolleys over, and then there were the drawbridges, and by 1978 we had 4 lanes both ways, and then in 1978 that ship hit the span, so they built the high-rise one at that time. And they also, made the improvements of the Fontley connector that goes right up the side of the hill. And all of those things were done in a shorter period of time than they probably would have. And just before 1978, there was a big kerfuffle, and West Seattle wanted to secede from the city of Seattle at that time. I think there's people talking about it even today. Anyway, West Seattle was annexed, the city of West Seattle was annexed into Seattle in 1907, the same time Ballard was and several other communities, and it almost doubled the population of Seattle. So that would be the Admiral District, and then you come down to the Junction. Do you know why the Junction's called the Junction?
No.
When you talk to a West Seattleite, and they say, I'll meet you at the Junction, they mean California Avenue and Alaska Street. Right?
Yeah.
And that's where the trolleys met, coming down from Admiral and going out to Endeline in Fauntleroy. That was one of the reasons. Also, there was some real estate development going on there, and they were trying to draw the businesses together to strengthen the business community in West Seattle. But somebody pointed out to me, and I didn't know this, that California Avenue actually had to be built up because it was swamp and springs around there. And what was it called? What was that area called? Spring Hill. Spring Hill. Yeah. I always want to say Spring Haven. I don't know why. Spring Hill. Yeah. And then we come down to Fauntleroy and Lincoln Park and where we're at. And it was called Lincoln Beach, and then they added the park. And it has that wonderful saltwater pool, living-size saltwater pool, Coleman Pool down there. And a wonderful promenade, and it's also a refreshing place to take a walk. And, but anyway, a ship captain was coming down on a geologic survey, and he wanted to name the area something, so he named it Fauntleroy after his father-in-law. And that was great when he got home. It was good for domestic tranquility. His wife was well pleased with that. And then the southern boundary of Seattle is Roxbury. And so White Center is a city unto itself. South Park is a community within Seattle. Back when they were trying to name White Center, there were two bigwigs, Mr. White and Mr. Green. And Mr. Green wanted to name the city after his good friend Mr. White, and Mr. White wanted to name it after his good friend Mr. Green. And so there's a story told that they flipped a coin, and who won? No, he lost because it was named after him. He wanted to name it after Mr. Green. If he would have won, it would have been Greenvale. And then you have Del Ridge, right? And there's a kind of a little dell. And then there's a ridge on one side and a ridge on the other side. And so it's the dell, farmer in the dell, between the ridges. So that's how it got its name, Del Ridge.
Oh, my God.
So, yes.
Does anybody know what Donald Duck's middle name is?
Donald Duck's middle name?
Fauntleroy.
Donald Fauntleroy Duck. Didn't know that. Now I do. See, I learn something every time. I learn something every time. Very good. I like that. So, well, that kind of concludes my little talk here, and we're certainly pleased that you came. I have a little gift for each of you from the Southwest Seattle Historical Museum, and we'll pass those out.
Is that the museum that's like a log cabin?
Yes. So some postcards and a pen. I hope we have enough.
I think we do.
I'll send my grand.
Southwest Seattle Historical. You gonna share or you want one to? Okay.
Is it color?
Good. Buy a ticket before I go on a trip.
I have two sons, and they live and raised over in that area. And sure I have one.
She's coming. I've got a bunch more. Do you want an extra one for him?